joining us this afternoon or morning or evening, whatever it is for you. We're greeting you from the University of Maryland, College Park. I'm Clara Irazábal. I serve here as the director of the Urban Studies and Planning Program. And I also serve the school as the JEDI officer, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And it's that collective, the JEDI collective, that is offering this dialogue series, the interdisciplinary dialogue series that is called Violence, Conflict, and Space, Peace Building Contributions from the Spatial Disciplines. The disciplines that we represent here in the school that are architecture, real estate development, urban planning, and historic preservation, and all the affiliated disciplines that relate to space. And this is the fourth and last of the dialogues in the series. This particular one is called Disrupting Slow Violence, Untapping the Healing Power of the Spatial Disciplines. We have a fabulous set of speakers in the panel for us today. They are going to start with a brief set of introductory remarks of not more than 5 minutes each, and then are going to be led in dialogue by our phenomenal lecturer in our program, Riem El-Sogdi, that is going to lead her in a dialogue about the topic, is slow violence, and then open it up for discussion with the audience here in person and online. Thank you very much for joining us. We're looking forward to this phenomenal, very timely conversation. I'll pass it on to Rima.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Clara. So I'm Rima Sogdi. As Clara said, I'm a lecturer in urban studies and planning program at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. And I currently teach a course on community development, where we have the privilege of working with local community stakeholders. And we're really honored to be hosting this dialogue in our class. I'm honored to be moderating today's dialogue, and I would like to introduce our esteemed panel. I'll briefly introduce the entire panel, and then I'll introduce each speaker and their topic just before the presentation. So we have, today we have Ashley Hernandez. She's an assistant professor in community development at the University of North Carolina. Welcome, Ashley. Can you hear? Talk loud. Okay. We also have Salam Aidul, an assistant professor of historic preservation at the Tulane School of Architecture. Welcome, Salam. We also have Elisa Dayanese, assistant professor of architecture at Georgia Institute of Technology. Welcome, Elisa. Maya Roberts, she's the vice president of real estate development, the Mid-Atlantic Preservation of Affordable Housing. Welcome, Maya. And we also have Noelle Alvarez, who is a PhD candidate here at the University of Maryland in urban and regional planning and design. So welcome, everyone. We're so grateful for your participation and honored that you are here with us this morning. So Dr. Ashley Hernandez will present first. So Dr. Hernandez is an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Ashley is a housing and community development scholar and a community-based researcher whose work emerges from her ongoing collaboration with advocacy and grassroots organizations in both California and North Carolina. Her work focuses on the conditions that bring about gentrification, housing instability, and displacement, along with a spectrum of strategies that cities and communities employ to shape development, protect vulnerable neighborhoods, and build broader movements for equitable development and housing. So she will share an overview of her research and methods on anti-gentrification activism, as well as some key lessons from her work. So Ashley, welcome. The floor is yours.
Hi, hello everyone. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I Want to thank Clara and everybody at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation for having me on this panel. It is an honor and privilege to be in community with you all virtually. I am going to share some slides if it's possible. Oh, it looks like I can't share actually.
Sure. Oh, your comments now, you can share.
Oh, perfect. I think I can share now. Wonderful. Okay. Perfect. Can y'all see my screen? Oh, wait, not yet. Okay, can y'all see this?
Yep.
Great. All right. So I am going to give a brief overview of some of my work and methods and key takeaways so that to participate in this dialogue so that you all kind of know the position from which I'm speaking and the things that I'm puzzling with and grappling with as well. So let's see. So my work, as was mentioned, centered on gentrification and neighborhood change in cities from Los Angeles to North Carolina or Durham, where I currently call home, Durham, North Carolina. But today I'm going to be specifically talking about my early work that extends from my PhD dissertation that has inspired a lot of the ways in which I grapple with and look at these issues. So my work as a PhD student focused on anti-gentrification activism in the Boyle Heights barrio of Los Angeles. It is a working class Latinx neighborhood that sits adjacent directly to downtown Los Angeles and has been experiencing gentrification. And I've been really kind of using Boyle Heights as my site to try to understand from Boyle Heights, how can we understand what gentrification is, what can we look to, and what are the various responses that are coming from communities. Alongside neighborhood change and gentrification, I also study how these phenomenon build upon histories of inequality and harm. So Boyle Heights is a really good site for this, as it is a historically redlined neighborhood. And so it has been grappling with all of the worst aspects of urban policy and geography since the neighborhood's inception. And so I study, right, how gentrification, neighborhood change builds upon this as an extension of this history and what does that teach us? But the lens through which I studied these issues is alongside and with community-based organizations in the neighborhood. It's essentially a spectrum of organizations that deploy a spectrum of strategies. So I work alongside your kind of traditional community-based nonprofit community development organizations or affordable housing developers, as well as more insurgent direct action organizations that seek to maintain their autonomy from the nonprofit sector or any kind of traditional politics. And I put these strategies in conversation with one another to understand what are these different from these different arenas, what are folks saying, and how are they engaging in the built environment? What are they pointing to? What can we learn from them? So from these different types of strategies, I have been able to be privy to the various types of tactics, whether it's engaging in traditional institutional channels or taking to the streets and using direct action, as well as the various types of discourses that groups use to describe the phenomenon that they are living through and that they have been grappling with. And in many instances, these organizations, strategies, tactics, and discourses come into sharp conflict with one another, which has kind of really taught me about the kind of parameters, boundaries, and struggles that are within the project of creating community. But in many ways, a lot of these strategies, tactics, and discourses overlap as well in really, really important and critical and interesting ways that can teach us a lot. Not just about gentrification, but about community and about the city and built environment. And really important to my work is also trying to understand that these struggles against gentrification, against displacement, are not just bounded to the neighborhood, but in many ways on both sides, from the traditional political organizations, community-based organizations, and those that are more autonomous and direct action-based, are engaging with other groups across the United States and building solidarities with organizations and communities that are undergoing the very same phenomenon that they are, and together are sharpening the language, strategies, and tactics that they are using across space. So happy to talk about this as well, but it's a really important aspect of my work. It's how it's not just bounded to the neighborhood. A lot of the methods that I use, I deploy community-based strategies where I work alongside groups, engaging in the very strategies that they are trying to forge in the neighborhood. And then very quickly, I would like to go over some lessons from this work. So although I do spend a lot of time charting the histories that these neighborhoods have kind of endured, and the folks in the neighborhood, how they chart their own histories, I put this in conversation with one another to kind of help amplify their voices and talk about how gentrification builds on a history of ongoing destabilization and cumulative dispossession, and what that does, right, to a community over time. But I also, alongside, chart the histories of activism that have happened over decades, right, where folks have continued to struggle repeatedly with one another. And that these struggles have continued to build on each other in powerful and important ways, right? And another really important lesson is how these various struggles and strategies reveal the various ways that these groups are engaging in urban planning, teaching us lessons from where they speak on the ways, the threats that they see and experience, but also the ways in which they define the very changes that are coming to their neighborhood and how they imagine their neighborhood and spaces to be in very, very powerful and brilliant ways as well. And then I'll finish just by saying that really importantly, I think I'd be happy to talk about this more, is how folks are kind of reimagining how we define what gentrification and dispossession mean in really important ways that are speaking from the various places that they are. And I think one thing that I'll impart on us all, that I continue to derive hope from this work and from spatial disciplines more broadly, is that they always reveal, when you're working alongside communities, that communities continue to do otherwise, and they continue to build spaces of mobilization, politicization, consciousness building, and relation with one another. And so I will leave it there. Thank you so much.
That was really wonderful. I really love how you talked about, the fact that these struggles are not bounded. And this history of ongoing destabilization and dispossession, and this new conceptualization of gentrification might be considered as a new form of colonization, of colonialism. So maybe we can think more about these ideas as we go forward. But next, I would like to introduce Dr. Falan Samuels-Aidu. Dr. Aidu investigates and consults on the preservation planning of diverse individuals and institutions. Her publications and public history projects focus on environmental hazards and development threats to heritage, as well as adaptation and resistance to them. She currently teaches in real estate development and historic preservation studios and seminars at Tulane, following faculty positions in planning and architectural education at the University of New Orleans, Northeastern University, and Harvard University. So Dr. Aidu's discussion for today is going to revolve around her current reflections on past moments when marginalized and vulnerable populations realized a long fought for dream deferred would take even longer than expected to materialize. So people of color with experience of dispossession and disinvestment have shown time and again how to plan the preservation of cultural property of others, including descendants after one's death. She looks to these cases of measured faith in individual and institutional stewardship, informed by attention to their capacity building, capital raising, and collective action. So, Dr. Aju, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you all for having me. I'm gonna also share a thing. Screen. Can minimize all these things. Okay. Turning on subtitles for those who can appreciate the Zoom closed captioning. So
Notes.
what's that?
We're seeing your notes.
Oh, okay. Apologies. Exit out of that. Yep, gonna just change that very quickly. And so don't think that they're already notes. And let's see if it still wants to show you notes. Well,
Yeah, swap.
Yeah, swap that first one.
yeah,
So, you-
all good now?
Swap presenter view.
Okay.
There.
Are you seeing a full screen?
Yes, yes, thank you.
Okay, all right. I had to put this at the end, so I'm just gonna. So, apologies. Try this again. So one of the things that I've been doing of late is reflecting on the work that I do and how I do it. Like many people who work with spaces and communities that have been largely disinvested or marginalized in some way, that kind of work and our partners in it are under threat chronically all the time, but right now rather acutely. And I've been thinking a lot about something I did quite some time ago, where I was teaching a class at Harvard's Graduate School of Design with two colleagues, one, Jay Shin, who was working for the New York City Public Housing Authority, and the other, Damon Rich, who was directing planning for the city of Newark, New Jersey. And we were engaged at that time to bring students into the process of planning how this Superfund site of a waterfront of Newark, New Jersey could be a space for imagining a future of prosperity and health and well-being for the largely Latinx communities that have developed along the waterfront neighborhoods. And what it was so much of a lesson in that design thinking doesn't necessarily result in plans and models and in the ways in which schools like, Maryland and every other school originally trained us to think about these things. And that a lot of that work is really outside of the realms of sometimes publication in our fields, preeminent journals, but also sometimes outside of the realm of our own kind of imaginative framings at the time, and that we have to be we have to at least put ourselves in the position of being more willing to adopt new pedagogy, adopt new ways of communicating, as well as new assessments of our impact on an issue and on the people that we're trying to serve. And this is just some of the things that came out of that actually ended up being the things that had the most staying power. The guide was adopted by the city council and then city hall, and a 3D model was put in the building for some time. But this, kind of touristy map actually had far more staying power with people because they could put it up anywhere, and it really helped. It was a reflection of the work that everyone had done to engage. Whereas like these very technical studies of disinvestment and redevelopment, not so much. And I was thinking about that a lot, and that a number of the communities that I have studied that are historic in age and in cultural identity and property, but not necessarily always in kind of designation, have been engaged in this really protracted process of recovery of both the physical assets and tangibility of that place and the kind of cultural identities that those places had and significance that the places had to those who have called it home. And a lot of my work revolves around the mechanisms by which people attempt those forms of recovery. I tend to focus my work on places that have been subject to a good amount of environmental threat, either in the past or they're at great environmental risk at present. And one of those is the area of Pontchartrain Park in New Orleans. And excuse me, and they've been at the center of a lot of debates, not just locally, but nationally and even internationally, around how does a place that was built in the kind of vernacular of real estate development in the post-war period of the United States, is it even worth trying to preserve that kind of place? And if you rebuild it after some form of disaster, as devastating as Hurricane Katrina, like in what form should it be built, and who should be deciding what form it takes, and who should fund those formulations? And the community took it upon themselves to develop, to create their own community development corporation and to orient that towards people preservation and property kind of preservation in terms of holding on to land, and then some architectural preservation. But to do that work, they needed to engage a really wide spectrum of funders. And a lot of my research revolves around how do these arrangements come to pass? And this chart here is just an illustration of the fact that it's not as simple as our kind of community development literature usually makes it out to be, in that there's a kind of, there are grants, maybe some from a public entity, there's some grants from some foundations, and that's the usual picture. But in actuality, these individuals who, some who day jobs doing something entirely different, are being thrust into the bifurcation of our financial system around asset management. And that has a lot of consequences for what results, but also when. And so this thing about kind of dreams deferred was really something that I've been grappling with as I return to these communities. I began working with Pontchartrain Parks Neighborhood Association in 2018, and a lot of the housing that they had been contracted to build has still not materialized for a number of reasons. And that community is also connected with another community here in New Orleans that has actually just gotten the funds to do the cleanup part of the project, not the and the planning of the reconstruction of some really important cultural assets, but again, it's very much at this phase in which they are legitimizing the need for the project to even be to be funded. And that legitimization process includes, adding this place to the National Register of Historic Places, promoting it through preservation communications, and engaging in every forum you can think of around planning and redevelopment. Most of my work is not taking place in New Orleans. It's taking place in New England, on the island of Massachusetts called Martha's Vineyard, where the socioeconomics couldn't be more different than New Orleans, but in so many ways the circumstances are the same. There's a largely grassroots community-based organization which is planning redevelopment of cultural assets with a cornucopia of private and public actors. And here you see in this groundbreaking picture, senators. If you don't know these individuals, right? There's some senators, there's some community leaders. Outside of this picture was Deval Patrick, who was a governor at the time of Massachusetts. There were so many ways in which this particular project should have been like greenlit and fast-tracked and so forth. And you can read all about it in an article coming out next month in the journal Change Over Time. But I bring this up because this is where Barack Obama's family vacations at Martha's Vineyard, right? And these are places that people don't think there's marginalization, don't think that there's any kind of impediments to heritage preservation and affordable housing need, let alone affordable housing development challenges. And so I approach this work with this question of kind of, well, what would make a observer of this kind of circumstance get past those assumptions and come to understand this place and New Orleans communities as part of a coalition. Well, could they be part of a coalition, but as a collective that is addressing and embracing the challenges of their respective locales with grace, frankly. Grace in the sense that they've let me in, they've let me be a part of their work, but also they've allowed me to explore it and to study it as an analyst and researcher, and have allowed for me to bring my students into it as well. And so I don't have any kind of grand pronouncements here to share. So just to say that I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you all and being in community with you all about the work beyond the work. There's the work of scholarship, there's the work of education, and and even the work of practice of like making these projects materialize. But I think that there's an additional layer of work that is even more, perhaps even more important at this point in time. And how do we convene with each other and to do that work? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shalom. That was really amazing. I love this notion of the work beyond the work, and I would love for us as a panel to get back to that concept. I also really, your idea of this what would make people see beyond an observer, see beyond the circumstances, and get past the assumptions ingrained, when we look at certain communities. I think that's an incredibly provocative idea, but I would love for us, to maybe come back to that idea. And then this notion also, that the work is actually a reflection of the work that everyone in the community has actually done, you know. So thank you so much for your wonderful presentation. Next, we have Dr. Alyssa Denesi. Alyssa is an assistant professor of history and theory of architecture at the Georgia Institute of Technology School of Architecture. She holds a PhD from the IUAV University in Venice, Italy, and she is a historian and theorist of architecture and urbanism who specializes in architectural knowledge, its production, and its transnational circulation. Her work expands on the current discourse surrounding architecture and its history by exposing the tensions between Western and non-Western modernism. Her unique method combines investigations of cross-cultural exchange and the recovery of historically underrepresented voices, including those of communities in the Sub-Sahara and the Arctic. So Alyssa's presentation focuses on post-World War II history of architecture in the Arctic. The discussion challenges existing interpretations of architectural history by introducing the role played by indigenous voices, activists, and transnational solidarity in the fight against land separation and dispossession in the region. The focus shifts to collective memory, indigenous testimonies, and intangible heritage. And the results question contemporary disciplinary ideas of authorship and canon. So, Elisa, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Ray. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Thanks for the kind introduction. Thanks for the invitation, Ray and Clara. I'm very excited to be here. It's very nice to see this very interdisciplinary panel. Let me share a few images. Can you see the presentation? Yes, okay. So as Ray explained, I am a historian with architectural background. So that's where I entered the discussion that we're having today. My most recent project examining the post-World War II period, the history of indigenous resistance to land separation, relocation, dispossession in the Arctic. It's a huge region. I look at the US, Alaska, the northern part of Canada, Nordic Europe, and Russia. The focus is on the role played by indigenous people, indigenous voices, activists, and transnational solidarity in the fight against dispossession, relocation in these northern regions. The project investigates social violence, environmental violence, and what was the attempted erasure of land care practices, landscape imageries that accompanied militarization, the modernization, the urbanization of the Arctic. And the period I'm looking at goes from the 50s to the late 70s. So it's a project that brings together different disciplines. I look at, obviously, modern architectural history, and here you have Ralph Hershkin, a member of Team 10, a famous group of architects. But I'm also interested in environmental history, indigenous criticism, post-colonial, decolonial theories. And I look at all these disciplines to ask a few important questions. I think they are significant. How did indigenous voices interpret land separation, decolonization, militarization of the Arctic, and its architecture in the post-war period? And which are the indigenous media, the indigenous archives that reported on Arctic dispossession, on Arctic urbanization? And how did indigenous knowledge on land separation activate? How did this knowledge resist architectural and urban projects of forced relocation? And then at the end of this, also, what was the role of indigenous Arctic activism in the international debate over architecture of displacement, over decolonization. So despite its historical significance, the built environment in the Arctic is a relatively understudied subject. It's only minimally been examined by architectural historians, for example. It's a disciplinary delay in a way. In existing architectural historiography, but also in everyday culture, post-war architecture in the Arctic is generally presented as the prerogative of design professionals, governmental clients, administrators, building research facilities or military camps in the north. It is the result of prefabricated experiments in North America and Northern Europe, or the product of specific national economic policies. I'm thinking about the Soviet collectivization, economic centralization in Sami, in the Sami territories, in the Russian Federation of the Chukotka regions, so near the Bering Straits, for example. But would we obtain a different history of post-war architecture if we were to consider land dispossession, relocation, urbanization from the perspective, for example, of Inuit storytellers of Northwest Alaska, or the Sami reindeers herders in Sapmi, or the Chukchi sea hunters in Hulin in Russia? And what if we could understand discussions over land separation, Arctic indigenous emancipation as having been an intrinsic component of broader imageries of decolonization and self-determination? So here you have an image, the 6 indigenous participants in the Arctic Council. They are transnational organizations by definition. Diplomacy, indigenous diplomacy in the Arctic has always been transnational. And you have the art piece of a Sami artist, Brita Marakarlaba, investigating this idea of circularity, this idea of continuity in space and time. That's typical, that's very present, more than typical, in indigenous societies in the Arctic. It's a vision that overcomes barriers and borders. So indigenous testimonies report on land separation, report on forced urbanization, the varied ways used by architects, designers, administrations, governments to rationalize displacement, to rationalize imposed resettlement. But they also give testimony of the post-war spatial transformation of the Arctic. They inform us of the technologies of separation that administrations utilize to recast indigenous land, indigenous life worlds as colonial orders. So as you see, it's a project that tries to adopt horizontal strategies of openness. It's a project of redefinition, reorientation of the historical discipline. And I'm thinking about architectural history more specifically. It investigates the right to have one's voice heard, the right of underrepresented community to possess a history. So I work on ideas, as Reem said at the beginning, of collective memory, collaborative knowledge production when there are survivors. And the idea is, the important point is to recuperate indigenous voices, the voices of activists, and ideas of transnational solidarity, which in turn allow me to reinterpret the materials present in the traditional archive that, as architectural historians, we are more used to consult in a way. And to keep this idea of horizontal openness alive, research outcomes, yes, they include a publication on the post-war colonization in the Arctic, yes, articles, etc., etc. But I'm also working on the idea of a testimony archive in different languages to present indigenous voices, indigenous narratives on displacement, and proposing, in a way, different ideas of authorship and canon that can be discussed in architectural history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. That was really spectacular. You brought up so many, very interesting, ideas and that I hope that we can, talk a little bit more about. I'm particularly interested in this notion of circularity and, continuity of space and time and this conception of this, within the Indigenous, community, the idea of transnational organizations and how this transcends national borders, and how it's conceptualized. And you had a phrase, the right to have their voice heard. We talk a lot about the right to the city, and I would love to speak a little bit more about Indigenous notions and other community notions of their right to be heard. So thank you so much for that. We're going to move on to Maya Shanklin-Roberts. Maya is POAH, which stands for the Preservation of Affordable Housing. She's the Vice President of Real Estate and Development for the Mid-Atlantic region, based in POAH's Washington, DC office. In this role, Maya manages their portfolio in the Mid-Atlantic region, including redevelopment of Berry Farm, part of the district's New Communities initiative to transform key neighborhoods by redeveloping public housing and the surrounding area into vibrant mixed-use, mixed-income communities. In addition, Maya represents POAH's before municipal and other regulatory boards, along with assessing the feasibility of other potential development opportunities in the region. Maya was a housing policy fellow at the Maryland Department and Community Development and supervisory program manager at the Coordinating Council on Youth Violence Prevention. She holds a JD from American University, Washington College of Law, a master's in community planning from the University of Maryland College Park, so she isn't alone, and a bachelor's of art in urban studies from Stanford University. We're thrilled that you could be with us today, Maya, so please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm super excited to be here and to present. It was super informational, like to learn all of about the work that the professors have been doing in this space. I come to you all for this presentation as a practitioner that is actively working to redevelop one of the really very harmed community in Washington, D.C., named Berry Farm. Berry Farm has a very storied and complicated and rich history that began in the early 1800s. It was a community founded actually by former freed slaves in Washington, D.C. They actually bought land from the federal government, built homes, and created a community and named it Hillsdale. Later on, fast forward to the 1940s, through urban renewal and all of the policies that we learn about in all of our planning and architecture and urban design schools, that community was taken away. And essentially what was built was public housing. And that's where the creation of the Berry Farm dwellings took place. And those buildings actually provided housing for Black government workers in Washington, D.C. And so it was actually a really renowned community at that time in the 1940s when it was established. Then fast forward to the 1980s, to the early, 1990s, 2000s, years of disinvestment, continued marginalization, continued community isolation has caused the deterioration of that community. What was once this really renowned and historic community owned by former slaves and built by former slaves, then becomes this really community of high crime and high violence. And it requires revitalization. And so there, the city decided that it would revitalize this community through a community planning process where it worked with community members and the local government through this public-private partnership and a kind of master developer. That's where POA steps in to come up with a community plan to build replacement units, bring new retail, improve circulation through better pedestrian and vehicular access, as well as provide, just more community amenities. And this project actually started in 2013 and actually way even before that. Fun fact, I was actually an intern with the DEMPED, which was the government agency that is sponsoring this initiative in 2008 when I was at Stanford University working on this initiative. And so this is a true full circle moment for me. So starting as an intern and now the master developer, I'm also a native Washingtonian. So I've seen and been engaged in this community, just from living here in the city. And also, pre-developer, I worked with young people who were engaged in gangs and crews. And so Berry Farm was one of our hotspot communities. And so I spent a number of years trying to support youth and families, kind of change their lives around and providing wraparound services. And so now kind of fast forward here to 2025. I've now been working for the last 2 years on this project to revitalize this community, which this rich and storied history, but also one that's very complicated, one that has immense trauma, and one that actually has a ton of conflict from the community. In fact, before I started, like I said, just to kind of give you guys a better sense of timeline. So POA was engaged as the developer in 2013. Our first building didn't go under construction until 2022. Why, you ask? There was actually a lawsuit filed against the project from the community. The claim was that the project in itself was facilitating the disenfranchisement and gentrification of this historically Black community. And so what community wanted was to ensure that residents were displaced, that we didn't create kind of this high dense, super urban, high rise community where residents weren't able to have access to both the housing as well as to the retail. And so what resulted from that lawsuit, basically 5+ years of negotiation and back and forth, was revised zoning that actually kind of sets the foundation for which the Berry Farm community will be revitalized through, as well as there are 5 public housing buildings that are going to remain on the site and are deemed historic. And so it is my job to preserve them and create a new use for them. In addition to creating, at the end of this, the project will have about 1,000 units, 380 of which are going to be replacement units for the former public housing units to replace the public housing units that were on site, as well as about 40,000 square feet of new retail space. So this is a very dynamic project, one that, in effect is intended to repair past harm. But I think the question that I have and, kind of what I bring in this discussion is, how do you do that? this again, it's repair of harm to whom, and for whom. As I said, this site in itself has been occupied by a number of people. So prior to even, the 1860s, there were natives that lived on this land and occupied the Hillsdale community, and that land was taken away from them. Then it was the Hillsdale community that was founded by, former slaves that built homes and purchased the land. And that land was then, taken from them. And while there is some evidence that there was some compensation given to those Black owners, we all know that that wasn't just compensation. And, so there is not that full, they were not made whole. And then fast forward to the public housing residents who have lived in this community, many of them for multiple generations, who at 2018, their homes were essentially demolished. So if you look at the site right now, except for our one new building, our bright new building that's on the site, it's a barren land, completely no homes exist except for those 5 public housing buildings. And so in 2018, for a period of 2 years, POA along with the city, demolished those units, and those residents, it was about 380, there were 444 public housing units. So let's just say about 400 families were dispersed or relocated across the District of Columbia. And while they were given vouchers or able to relocate in other public housing, they, essentially were removed from their homes. And, how people want to talk about it, it's complicated in itself, but at the end of the day, that relocation happened and that created harm. But mind you, we are now in 2025. And so those families that left the site in 2018 and 2019, many of them are still gone. And my project won't be complete until 2030. And so for over 10 years, more or less, the families have lived in different places. And so we have multiple generations of people that, as a result of, local, federal, all of the forces that may be, have been negatively impacted. And we now have this one opportunity to create this, new community, no pun intended, to repair that harm, bring this new affordable housing product, provide retail space, all of the good things that we learn about that makes a great community. But then what exactly does that mean, right? My job is to build bricks and sticks. But as we know, a community isn't just bricks and sticks. The color of the community, the culture of the community, what makes people want to live there, play there, work there, right? There are those soft things that must also be layered in. And for me as a Black woman in development, also as a native Washingtonian who grew up in affordable housing, the way that I view my work is largely shaped by my personal experience, but that isn't necessarily the same personal experience that many of my peers who are developers doing the same thing. And so when I kind of, right now, just last night was home thinking about all of the young people that are congregating outside of the buildings, like hanging out on the corners. And I'm like, what am I going to do for these young people who, used to live in this neighborhood, come back to this neighborhood, the weather is getting warm and there is no place on the site. As I said, most of it is still demolished, for them to hang out, for them to socialize, for them to recreate. I mean, in a sense, because, not taking personally, but we took that away from them through this redevelopment process. And so is it my job to provide opportunity for them in the interim? Or is it my job to tell them to wait until we're done, right? And how active or passive I am in thinking about the whole community, especially in this interim period, this 10-year project, I think is the work that has to be done because, you know, as you all heard before, development takes a long time. We can have these grand plans, and every year my budget changes. Every year, you know, there's delay with respect to permits and approvals. And so there is no certainty. And so while I have this beautiful master plan of what we will do, how we will do that is largely shaped by me and my team and how we want to think about kind of a trauma-informed or equitable development practice that places community first, as well as thinking about this community holistically. So excited to be a part of this conversation because this is really real for me, especially as I'm actively working to, you know, think about all of the theory and all of the things that I've learned over these years, and put that into practice on this site.
Thank you so much, Maya. That was really a wonderful presentation, and thank you for bringing in the work of POA and, you know, giving us an overview of how the project and the public-private partnerships really take place. I want to come back hopefully to this, something that you raised, which is the project having the intention of repairing harm, but this notion and this question, which is quite vital and one that we have been struggling with and talking about at length in our class, is for whom? So who is the community? And not only who is the community, for whom are we planning, but how will the project lead to this repair? So thank you so much for bringing that up, and I hope we can talk more about that. Next, we have Noelle Alvarez. Noelle is a doctoral candidate in the University of Maryland School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. She's in the Urban and Regional Planning and Design program. So she recently defended her dissertation just 2 weeks ago. Congratulations. And she will begin a postdoctoral fellowship in July. And she's originally from Miami, but she's lived in the area for the last 9 years. In her spare time, she plays with a music collective. So Noelle will talk about how slow violence manifests in low-income, working-class immigrant communities, particularly those facing redevelopment and gentrification. So as planners, we need to think about all the various dimensions through which harm is enacted, including federal immigration policies, policing, criminalization of daily life, historically and contemporarily. So spatial disciplines like planning and design can replace slow violence when these forms of structural violence are recognized and challenged. So she will bring in some of her dissertation findings and discuss what this looks like. So thank you so much, Noelle. You have the floor.
Hi everyone. I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, I just wanted to share I'm gonna share my screen like this. So hi everyone, my name's Noelle Alvarez. I did just defend last 2 weeks. So my mind is still like all over the place. But I'm going to talk about one of my chapters in my dissertation, just very briefly give you the spark notes of one of my arguments that I'm speaking on. And this chapter is called Slow Legal Violence, How Disinvestment, Migrations, and Marginality Shape Langley Park's Landscape. So Langley Park is a tri-jurisdictional, unincorporated immigrant suburb just outside Washington, D.C. It is home to a predominantly Central American population, especially from Guatemala and El Salvador. And right now there's a growing Maya population, particularly the Hmong community. So in Guatemala, there are about 23 ethnic groups, and within that is the Maya Mom community. So for the last, I would say 3 decades, it's been a hub for working class, immigrants, and mixed status families, and is undergoing currently redevelopment with the construction of the Purple Line light rail. So as you can see in the map, it's going to be a hub for 2 stations for the Purple Line. And just to give you a little bit of background of the demographics, its population, so you can see here I have the census designated place border. So around that it is about 20,000 people that live there, and it's a very small, densely populated place. 28.2% of the population live below the poverty line, and that's the double rate of the DMV, so DC, Maryland, Virginia, and Maryland. But as I talk about and I discuss in my dissertation, although that's the census designated place border, people that live there or outside the border, so right outside, they see the whole area pretty much where the square is as being part of Langley Park, even though Langley Park is made of 3 jurisdictions. And that's Prince George's County, which is the unincorporated part, and that's the designated place border that you see in the map, as well as the city of Tacoma Park and Montgomery County. And the city of Tacoma Park is in Montgomery County. So I wanted to just have this quote, this anecdote during one of my interviews that I was speaking with one of the community leaders of Langley Park, who runs a recently newish civic association. But it's a civic association in that they invite nonprofits to share how they're engaging with the community, usually monthly or quarterly. And I asked him, you know, why is Langley Park the way it is? And he goes, well, Langley Park has always suffered from this. I'm not sure if it's negligence or what, but this lack of attention to the needs of the community, a lack of understanding for the community or who is in the community, what their needs are, what services are necessary in the area, and the language barriers and a bunch of other things. I ask him why he thinks that happens. He responds, maybe because, I don't know, I sometimes think it's because there's a Latino community and many may be undocumented. And so there's no need to bring services because they're not even voting. So what's the point, right? So that may be one aspect of it. And so the other is that I don't believe the county, and he's referring to Prince George's County, has responded with bilingual staff to devote attention to our communities. I don't see many bilingual staff to assist in helping unless we bring the services. We bring the agencies to meetings or conferences or things like that. So this is kind of like that sentiment that you kind of hear from people that live in Langley Park, that they feel neglected from institutional stakeholders, from elected officials, sometimes even from community nonprofit organizations, that they're just, that's just how it is. And they just kind of surrender to that. But they're surrendering in the way that they're also devoting, they're adapting in their own ways. Now, I really wanted to understand when I started the dissertation who Langley Park is and why is it the way that it is, and why do people, even elected officials, see it in this kind of negative way, you know, where, oh, there's crime there, there's always this perception, right? And over time, I would ask people like, why do you think there's so much crime? Why is this? And even people that work there or live there, or even people that do like work there or elected officials, it's always been kind of like a hearsay thing, like this is what happens. So to kind of look at the past of Langley Park, I was lucky enough to have access to historical archival from a former urban planning professor at the University of Maryland. And within these boxes, it was like 10, 15 boxes that I found at school. He had collected articles from the 1970s, from the 80s and 90s, 2000s. And a lot of those articles were also articles that were from community newspapers that don't even exist anymore. So I should really like acknowledge community newspapers in my acknowledgement in my dissertation, because I tried to go online and find them just to have another access point to it, and I couldn't find it. And I feel like without this tangible piece, I wouldn't have been able to really know more about the history and what people were talking about in the media about Langley Park. But this article here is from the 1970s, and it's from a local community newspaper. And even back then, even before Langley Park became the way that it is, a predominantly Latino Central American community, it was already becoming diverse. And this, you know, they called it mini America. And a lot of leaders at that time were starting to speak out and claim, you know, why don't we have libraries? Why don't we have health facilities? Where are the services? And that's where I started learning more about, you know, how this disinvestment has existed over time. And through this archival and field work, I uncovered a long history of this uneven development and systemic neglect. And Langley Park is basically, like I was saying, a densely populated immigrant-rich community that is home to a majority Central American. And I thought about slow violence because Dr. Irasabal brought it up in one of my presentations last year. And I had been thinking more about the concept of legal violence, which I will discuss later, and how I combine them. But I started thinking more about slow violence and how a lot of the migrants that have come to Langley Park have endured slow violence twice. So once through civil wars and trauma from their countries of origin, and then again here through disinvestment, these legal restrictions and redevelopment pressures. And this ultimately became my first argument in my dissertation, that slow legal violence is a form of displacement that is being experienced by Central Americans in the communities. Now, Rob Nixon defines slow violence as neither spectacular nor instantaneous, but rather incremental and accretive. And it impacts and unfolds gradually across time and space. In Langley Park, displacement doesn't always appear dramatic. It shows up in small, everyday disruptions. So this means through policing of vendors, shifting zoning codes, increased surveillance, and crumbling infrastructure. So I also leaned on Leslie Kern, who helps us see this as temporal displacement, a slow erosion of the ability to exist in space and time. And building on this, I focus on how slow violence intersects with race, gender, and legal status. So I even furthered this through Christian and Doller's feminist critique, where I argue that slow violence is also deeply gendered and racialized, especially for Indigenous and working class Central American women. Because for them, illegality is not just about immigration status, it's also about being excluded from public space, from the local economy, from care. So as Langley Park was becoming this disinvested place, but it was also being changed demographically by the increase of Central American migrants who were neglected from participating in these formal economic systems because of their status. Usually, they were also being faced with this type of legal violence, which Menjivar and Abrego described as operating through quality of life ordinances, trespassing enforcement, and vending restrictions. So these aren't neutral policies. They decriminalize the informal economies that residents rely on: street vending, food trucks, domestic labor, and day work. So these ordinances not only regulate space, they reinforce who is deemed legitimate and who is not. So I see how through the archives and the history, I see how this plays out in Langley Park and across the 3 jurisdictions where police, code enforcement, and property owners have used formal regulations to displace or silence immigrant laborers. So these policies are treating community members not as neighbors, but as risks to be managed. So this is where I draw on slow legal violence, which is a harm that is state-sanctioned, cumulative, and hidden in plain sight. So it's not just about removal, it's about making life unlivable. And too often planners frame displacement primarily in economic terms. And I do agree with what Dr. Hernandez was saying, that we need to rethink what gentrification looks like for marginalized communities, because in economic terms, we're speaking of rising rents, loss of affordable housing, but this lens sometimes misses how displacement is also deeply racialized and operating through law, surveillance, and spatial exclusions that is disproportionately impacting immigrants, people of color, and particularly women. So another quote from my dissertation, I was speaking to the county's economic development director. And he tells me, I would challenge anyone to show me an example of that yet. Of that, he means by gentrification and displacement. And he adds that the purple line, now remember there's a purple line being built right now at the light rail. He adds that the purple line will bring great benefits to the community, true, but he states, there will be change, there will be growth, frankly, there will be improvement, but I don't think we've seen gentrification yet. So like him and others, for them, gentrification hasn't appeared yet because in their mind, gentrification is more about the high-rise luxury amenities, right? But they're not thinking about yet how the community is being impacted in this moment and has been impacted historically. So I guess to conclude this conversation, because I know I have 5 minutes, but to untap the healing power of the spatial disciplines, I think we must shift our gaze not just to what is being lost, but to what communities are already doing to survive, resist, and heal. And in my other chapters, I speak on the vendors, the home-based businesses, and some of the immigrant businesses that are there in Langley Park. And I refer to that as the everyday economies, and how they are, through the everyday economies, these are practices of care, transnational belonging, and they are adapting to what they have, and they're challenging the erasure imposed by these policies. So healing then, to me, begins by making these everyday practices visible and asking whose spatial knowledge matters and whose rhythms of life deserve to be protected. Yeah, so that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naomi, for that. I mean, just hearing you reflect on Langley Park, you could have been speaking about some of the communities in Cairo that I do research in, that I work with. It's really incredible. Thank you for bringing up this notion of slow legal violence and this notion of illegality, and how illegality is oftentimes gendered and racialized. And this notion of systemic neglect and uneven development, and how that manifests in these communities. I would like to open it to the floor for questions, but as people are gathering their thoughts, I'd like to pose this question to the panel. We've been talking a lot about restoration and healing powers of the spatial disciplines, but restoration implies going back to a previous state, before harm was inflicted. So how can we conceive of restoration in the context of space and the spatial disciplines? And what does restorative justice look like in the projects and the spaces that you work in? And please, anyone, feel free to jump in and respond.
I mean, I think, I was mentioning, restorative justice for me as a developer is the creation of space that community feels ownership of, that they actively participate in the creation of. I think what is difficult, though, is that there is, social, cultural, and economic loss. And what a lot of community want, and this kind of materializes in my space through like community benefit agreements, is some sort of economic repair. And unfortunately, like in affordable housing, there isn't necessarily that direct economic like reimbursement to the community other than the creation and investment of these assets, which are for the most part not really owned by the community themselves. I think, we have examples where community development corporations do their own development, and that I think is a great example of how community ownership wins, and that there is economic redress and restoration. But that is not common. That is more the exception to the rule. And so I think there is this need to push a little harder on how there is real economic that redistribution of wealth and the creation of wealth within these communities, beyond just kind of like this social and cultural improvement and justice that is given when we revitalize communities that have been harmed.
Yeah, thank you, Maya. Would anyone else like to add or comment on this notion of restorative justice?
I'll add something. I think that oftentimes the work that people are doing, I really like that Noelle mentioned or framed the work that people are doing in their homes or on the street in terms of their business. It's like everyday economies, and that it is there are ways to quantify labor. That's what economists do all the time, and the creation of time, the creation of space, the convening of people to produce whatever is being sold or whatever services are being provided. And I don't think that enough attention is paid to how and what is being invested in these communities as they are surviving. And in these interim, I think Maya mentioned these interim periods, like how we account for that. We don't have good measures. And as a discipline of planning, despite all the work that's been done on informal urbanism, I think that there's still, like both contemporary and historically speaking, there's still pretty site-specific, time-specific ways of approaching like the affirmation of the work, but not so much the accounting of it. And I think, quite frankly, one of the things that people bring to these conversations around new development is the fact that they have invested in this place over generations. They have put down roots, not just culturally and community building, but they have an economic stake too. And I think until we're able to adequately capture what that is, it's hard to then assess what, if any, instrument will enable us to not even, I don't know, it's not even restore, but act as some kind of recognition of that investment. And I get that, like, move away from restorative justice even as an agenda for planning to reparative justice, because that's about kind of addressing harm and trauma. But I do think that it's almost like an end run around this particular problem that we have, which is that we don't know how to, and thus we're not really taking on the really tough task of determining what are people's actual stakes in the place, and that they have accrued over time, over a collective of people, and that requires, I think, a different investment on our part in this work than maybe our respective like institutions have afforded us.
Thank you so much. We have a question for Dr. Elisa. So Jenny asks, with climate change and the thawing of the permafrost, how are the people of the Arctic preparing for protection of cultural artifacts and community gathering places?
Thanks. Well, that's a huge question. There are lots of groups involved, right? I very briefly mentioned the 6 major indigenous groups in the Arctic. They all have an agenda. They all meet periodically, and in their agenda, climate change is one of the top priorities. But that works together with issues connected with social justice, so cultural preservation in a way. For them, it's the two topics are interconnected. My research is more focused on ideas of cultural protection, right? So, for example, when I look at the Sami Council, so Nordic Europe, the Sami communities in Sweden, Finland, Norway, or in the Russia Peninsula, the Kola Peninsula, they all agree that there's a need to preserve storytelling as an activity, and in particular storytelling when it talks about landscape, when it talks about the land, when it talks about nature, etc., etc. So there's some interest in this idea of the coloniality of knowledge, right? How to preserve indigenous practices, where they are preserved, but it's architecture is part of it. Performance is also part of it. So the act of preserving something that's repeated over time and can be repeated through generations, and landscape. So a more complex, holistic view of what is related with the idea of artifacts. If the question was more focused on scientific research, for example, some researchers, scientists in Canada have started to work with indigenous communities to talk about climate change, talk about collaborative knowledge production, and see if Western ways of understanding science and what a laboratory is and what science techniques can be. So if this can be questioned, challenged, enriched by looking at the different perspective, the indigenous perspective on nature, on this kind of knowledge on landscape and climate. So again, it's a lot. I hope I answered a little.
We're already on time, so we need to bring this to a close, but I wanted to thank everybody for their contributions, phenomenal, and a lot of food for thought to continue the discussion. I want also to invite everybody to check on all the dialogues that are on the web. Shanta is gonna share with us the link on the chat, so please check it out. And I'm going to invite lastly one of the speakers to respond very briefly to this last question, to send a message of hope to the new generation of practitioners that are information now on what or how can they rekindle the notion that attracted them first to the disciplines, the spatial disciplines as instruments to transform the world to a better place, or to say it different, to the notion that the spatial disciplines had that power of healing.
May I, very quickly?
Yeah, very briefly, please.
You go out, you talk with people, you listen to their problem, and you stay with them, and you look at what they do, what they've done, and then you become interested in the past and finding answers to those problems.
Fabulous. On that note, again, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.